Hello. Welcome to this new series of Dynamic Antitrust. My name is Aurelien Portuese. I'm Director of Antitrust and Innovation Policy at Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And for this new series of Dynamic Antitrust in partnership with Competition Policy International, we're delighted to receive Professor Emeritus Richard Gilbert from Berkeley University for the presentation and also a discussion on his latest book, Innovation Matters, Competition Policy in the High Technology Economy. Richard, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome.
Pleasure to be with you, Aurelien.
Great.
Look forward to it.
So we're going to have this discussion on your latest book, which is a very important book. I mean, you've been professor for many years, many decades. You've worked also at the Department of Justice as an economist. And it looks like this book is a compilation of your knowledge, your research, what you've taught for many years, and your expertise on these relation between competition and innovation. So why have you wrote this book?
Well, in many ways it is, as you described. My academic career has been mostly focused on innovation issues and competition policy, a few other detours, but I've always come back to that and enjoyed it. And then I spent a time at the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. And when I went there, I was interested in innovation issues at the time. And really at that time, this was 1993, quite a while ago, antitrust was really all about price. We were starting the Microsoft investigation that led to the Microsoft antitrust case. And so innovation was an issue. I had a great opportunity to put together a team, and we developed guidelines for the licensing of intellectual property. So that was an issue that brought technology and innovation to the forefront. And then really from that point on, there was a change in antitrust enforcement. You can see it. You can see it in the cases that before that time, if there was a merger case, didn't matter what the industry was in, the complaint that was issued in a merger case rarely ever mentioned innovation. Starting from around 1995, you now see virtually every complaint that's in a high-tech industry now mentions innovation as an issue, as a concern. But there was still quite a gap between being worried about innovation. It was kind of like the weather. It was like, we talked about it a lot. It comes up in the complaints, but nobody's doing anything about it. And there's a lot of questions about how to do it. And it really has not been tested. You see, we can count scores of complaints, many complaints, formal complaints in antitrust that include innovation, but it's never really been tested on its own in court. So we needed a way to think about it. What are the obstacles? What do we know? What if we really have to do an antitrust case that focuses on innovation? And that really motivated the book. And we may well have a chance to test it now because we have these cases against Google and Facebook, where innovation is really front and center in those cases.
Right. That's very interesting to trace the history, or at least the growing importance of innovation in antitrust only since the 90s. And I think you're completely right. It has been largely overlooked in the preceding decades, and so it's also very interesting to see that it's with the high-tech markets that innovation has become some sort of concern, and your book is precisely to advocate for a shift. I mean, we have perhaps focused too much, as you just rightly said, too much on price for many decades, and innovation has become a concern quite recently for the last 20 years. And I mean, you in this book, you advocate for a shift from what you call a price-centric antitrust enforcement toward a more innovation-centric antitrust enforcement. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
It means being more forward-looking, being somewhat broader in your concerns. There's some people that have criticized the price-centric approach to antitrust enforcement and have really highlighted the consumer welfare standard. And some people have said we have to get rid of the consumer welfare standard in order to cast a broader net, if you will, for antitrust. I don't agree with that approach. Instead, what I think we need to do is to look more about, be more concerned about, the potential of competition to create new products, the concerns about exclusion, concerns about acquisition of nascent competitors, the whole potential competition doctrine. Let's start with the potential competition doctrine. That's sort of a favorite of mine, which is it's very hard to win today a potential competition case, at least in the U.S. I'm more familiar with the U.S. enforcement because the courts tend to take the approach that if somebody hasn't entered the market yet, then why will they enter the market in the future? Right. So if
it's backward looking, not forward looking.
That's right. And they look at probabilities of entry, things like that. But the issue really should be: is there an elimination of a firm that could be a very significant competitor in the future? Right. And even if the probability is not very high, if the acquisition doesn't have any associated benefits or efficiencies, any good things that come from this acquisition, the question is, why do you want to take the risk of eliminating a possibly very significant competitor? So I would call that a more innovation-centric approach to potential competition analysis than what we have now today, what we do today.
Right, and also potential competition can be that's one aspect. Potential competition can also be from a geographic relevant market where you can have also potential entrants from foreign entrants or from different geographic markets in the relevant market. Is that something that it is included as well in the innovation-centric?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, one of the more recent cases was just like that. It was a foreign firm that could have entered, another market.
The threat. So you just said that the consumer. I mean, some argue to ditch the consumer welfare standards, and I think it can be an exaggerate and very inconsiderable claim. But also we have to put more innovation. So it looks like the consumer welfare standard is advocating for allocative and productive efficiency, and of course innovation is something that pertains to dynamic efficiency. So overall, it remains within the efficiency model equilibrium analysis. Is that right? So that you will have the three aspect of efficiency: allocative, productive, and dynamic efficiency, more bundled together in your proposal.
Precisely. One of the great advantages of antitrust enforcement, the way it has developed, is that it is well grounded in principles. Now, the principles may be too restrictive, but it's very well grounded. I don't think we should give up a standard that really holds enforcers' feet to the fire. They have to prove their case. And we don't want a standard that just says, we don't like bigness, we don't like these types of firms or that types of firms. We don't like the way the CEO is behaving, and allow politics to enter antitrust enforcement. We
discretionary.
We don't want discretion to run rampant.
Yeah.
But we do want to focus on cases that may, or combinations or conduct that may harm consumers. It's just that we shouldn't look just at the short run. We should look at the long run.
Exactly.
What are the future effects of the conduct?
And I mean, that's totally right, and that's very sensible. And to move, I mean, the blame we can have on the excessively price-centric antitrust enforcement most of the time also pare down to, and you explain that very well in your book, to the very way we define markets and the way we approach market for what we call antitrust purposes. So is there any relevance of relevant markets?
That's a good question. And I mean, I want to address that, but I also want to say one other thing first, which is that an innovation-centric approach doesn't necessarily mean more enforcement. It can mean less enforcement. There can be circumstances in which the potential for innovation is so great that, say, the elimination of a single competitor is not a big deal because we expect innovations to come from somewhere else. So it can go both ways. But you mentioned market definition. And market definition it's a tool that seems to have taken over the machine shop, if you will. I mean, it is
like Frankenstein, like
it's a Frankenstein's monster. I mean, it's useful as a tool.
Yeah,
it has achieved such prominence in antitrust enforcement that it is often now counterproductive. I mean, we've actually seen cases where courts have acknowledged that there are competitive effects, but then rejected complaints because the market wasn't defined right. Now, please, the point of market definition is to define, is to identify the competitive effects if you already know they're there. And market definition is particularly troublesome if you're looking at innovation and forward-looking, anticipating things that haven't happened yet. So how do you define the contours of the market? It doesn't mean there won't be a competitive effect. It just means that we have to accept the fact that the competitive effect may not be able to be described exactly or precisely.
And despite all the efforts, market definition remain very price-centric. I mean, we've tried to put quality or other aspect into market definition, but the price remains the primary criterion for market definition, and thereby, I mean, condition and lead to the antitrust analysis we have, right?
Yes. You know, the most recent version of the U.S. merger guidelines really stepped back from market definition. They did something highly unusual, which is they changed the order of the analysis and put market definition behind competitive effects.
The 2010 merger guidelines,
but still, getting courts to move away from this is really very, very difficult. And I mean, it's not just the fact that they're price-centric, it's just that there's some things, you know, if two companies are going to merge, both of them have products in development, but neither of the products have actually been developed yet. And you don't know what they're going to be after they merge, but there's a good chance they're going to overlap. How do you define the market? It's not a market definition analysis.
Definitely, and very interestingly, what you just said, the court or authorities also sometimes they don't carry out market definition because they acknowledge that they cannot, and so it brings also more discretionary power of relying on market definition sometimes and not relying on market definitions on other times. And so this is it is questionable as a consistent analytical tool to rely on. But I think there's one element that could perhaps bring some answers, which is in your book. You define what you call these innovation markets or research and development markets. So these are the markets which are perhaps high-tech markets, but where capital, innovation, R&D are very important. Can you elaborate on this notion of innovation markets?
Sure. We introduced that concept when I was at the Antitrust Division in the guidelines for the licensing of intellectual property. And it got a lot of pushback. And people who are wedded to the conventional market definition approach said, where's the product? How do you define the prices? Is it a traded product? All these sort of things. Mm-hmm. But they really, I think, missed the point, which is market definition, whether you're talking about product markets, innovation markets, R&D markets, they're tools. They're tools that you can use to help inform an analysis. It's not an end to itself. And whether you call it an innovation market, or now they call it a research and development market, it's just a way to identify the likely participants in some transaction that may have, or some allegation, competitive situation that might have a competitive effect. And so it's just a useful construct. It's not an end to itself.
So you will feel more the competitive constraints more subjectively and also more realistically, rather than looking at defining market in a very static way. Is that right?
Right, but it's also a limiting tool because in a way, when we talk about innovation and we talk about research and development, in a way, we're really defining the activity too broadly, because antitrust is not likely to have much of an impact on pure research. It's going to be on development. It's going to be on cases where you can identify who is doing what and how likely it is that they are most or all of the participants in some activity. So the first innovation case, which we brought when it was back in 1994, I think it was, involved garbage trucks, actually automatic transmissions for refuse trucks. And because you could identify who was in that market, a very limited market. So you might see an innovation analysis where you can identify the players, where you can identify those who have the required research and development assets. It's not going to be for the next moonshot.
Yeah, and it will perhaps look at more the industry patterns rather than strictly the market, right? So it will also look at sectors, industry, the way these sectors and industry will evolve, because there can be competition and competitive constraint across different markets.
Right? Indeed, there can be. But if they're too hard to describe, then it's probably not a case where you can justify a sufficient concentration of R&D activity to make a challenge.
Right. On more theoretical aspect, in your book, you discuss these innovation fairies from Arrow, Schumpeter, and of course your own research, and that is very interesting because these authors, of course, have written about the relationship between innovation and competition. This has been the topic for many decades, and you explained very well those theories of Arrow and Schumpeter, and then you conclude that neither Arrow nor Schumpeter have developed theories which describe innovation incentives that apply more to dynamic markets. So, and that's why you explain, you develop this idea of applying both Arrow and Schumpeter to more dynamic markets. To what extent Arrow and Schumpeter, this some say the fruitless debate, how to that extent this debate is just not leading to antitrust implications for dynamic markets?
Well, they're really both Arrow and Schumpeter, and I really want to get a picture that you have behind you. They are really the twin pillars of innovation, and they're not going to go away. But both of them described a almost static description of the considerations that they were trying to identify. And what you see happening now, work by, for example, Philippe Aghion and many others working collaboratively, have identified how the forces that Kenneth Arrow and Joseph Schumpeter have so very beautifully described can be worked together in a dynamic context to have competition move the market one way versus the other with respect to innovation.
That's the two-stage scenario that you built and you've developed, and also with in different sense of literature, Philippe Aghion. I mean, there's a dual causal relationship between competition and innovation. Competition creates innovations, but also it's innovation that creates competition. That's why it's very complex.
That's a major concern. That's a major concern. We need more work in theory and in empirical side to identify these issues. And really, particularly on the empirical side, the fact that that innovations create market power, and that market power has an effect on the incentive to innovate simultaneously. You have this causation and reverse causation that can be very difficult to untangle.
One example is the patents, right? You create exclusive right, monopoly right, in order to incentivize innovation. This is where you have this appropriation effect, or at least the prospect of appropriating profits in order to spur innovation and competition. And what kind of lessons do we learn from markets where there's less patents or the competition is less legally protected?
Well, there are a number of empirical studies, a number of empirical ways to go about this. One of the standard way are these cross-section industry studies, which have the concern, they have a lot of concerns, the fact that you have this causality issue and reverse causality issue, how to untangle that. There's, the fact that research and development expenditures are not an output in themselves. R&D is not innovation, it's an input into innovation. And I mean, some of the better studies are well aware of these issues, and they try very hard to sort them out. But then we have other ways of doing it. There are a lot of case studies. Case studies are very informative.
Right.
And then there's an area that I find very informative is there are instances, often unanticipated instances of compulsory licensing.
Right.
Someone just comes along and says, either for an antitrust reason, or one example is wars that create compulsory licensing obligations. You can see how that affects the industry, and try to understand, the issues from that as well.
That's right, and that's exactly compulsory licensing. It's something that is being revived in today's debates. Like some players who are deemed to be gatekeepers, and there might be, or at least some legislative proposals are suggesting that some sort of compulsory licensing could be applicable in also behind data interoperability, but more precisely with compulsory licensing could be applicable. What do you think about those regulatory obligations that could be applied both in the US or in the EU? But we see these initiatives.
We have to tread carefully in this area. There, definitely concerns about, killing the goose that lays the golden egg here. You do not want to remove, incentives to innovate. You don't want to undermine incentives to innovate. There's no question that patents for example, play a role in incentives to innovate. I think not as much of a role as some people believe, but certainly in some industries, they're very, very important. And broad compulsory licensing obligations, I do think would have harmful effects on innovation. But at the same time, you do see examples where instances of compulsory licensing have had very beneficial effects. Examples, one of the best examples was the Bell Labs AT&T consent decree back in 1956, which some people have said you couldn't have the modern semiconductor industry without that consent decree. Because it just opened up so many patents without obligations. There was an IBM consent decree. There was a Xerox consent decree. And the important thing about what you see from these studies is, even though there's a major concern that if you had uniform compulsory licensing, it would be very harmful. At the same time, what we see is that innovation can thrive after these compulsory licensing decrees. That even the parties that are subject to the compulsory licensing obligations still continue to innovate.
Like AT&T.
AT&T, Xerox. Colleague Petra Moser is writing a book about this, showing how some of the broad compulsory licensing obligations during World War I and specifically opened up markets in broad ways.
But there's always these risks of free ridership, where you give rivals these very essential assets. I mean, they are deemed to be indispensable or essential, and precisely they are strategic assets. I mean, in Xerox, you can see that a number of Japanese competitors benefited from that, and you see how also after that these of course, benefited some rivals. So how can we, in one way, on one hand, increase innovation and competition, but on the other hand, avoid some sort of rent sinking or free ridership issues? This is a very complex issue.
Yeah, everything has to be done with appropriate balance, and I'm certainly not someone who would say, let's just give up property rights, intellectual property rights altogether, and the world's going to be a better place. I don't believe that's the case. It's really more a combination of bringing a more forward-looking attitude into the analysis. It's avoiding some of these conventions that we have, or approaches that we have that are very limiting. We may have to build antitrust enforcement a little more on sound presumptions, even if it's not absolutely something we can validate from the record in front of us on a particular case.
In your book, you refer to the truncated rule of reason. What do you imply by this truncated rule of reason, which is somehow some sound presumptions?
Yes, that's for a particular problem in this whole innovation area, which is the topic that is sometimes called predatory innovation.
Right.
And it comes up in a lot of different ways, and we're seeing it today with some of the Google allegations. It's this idea that when a dominant firm innovates, it may be excluding rivals in ways that are not justified by the innovation. The way this has been most used is in the context of what are these exclusionary patenting cases in the pharmaceutical area, sometimes called product hopping. It's where a branded drug manufacturer may innovate in order to exclude generic competition.
Right.
They're very difficult to analyze because you don't want to condemn innovation. And at the same time, they can be very exclusionary. The conduct can be very exclusionary. And this truncated rule of reason says, in effect, that you apply the rule of reason to look at both competitive effects and efficiencies,
Right.
but only in limited circumstances where the innovations can, in fact, be the value of the innovations can be estimated and shown to be, not breakthrough innovations and quantified against the anti-competitive effects.
Right. So it's very much like a balancing exercise for authorities and the courts. It's a balancing exercise between efficiency considerations and innovation considerations. But it is still a balancing exercise as opposed to some regulatory proposals that we see those days where there is this ex ante obligations so that there's some regulatory compliance without the balancing exercise that can be imposed on large platforms. What do you think about those debates, mostly in Europe with the Digital Markets Act, but to a lesser extent also in the US with those ideas of saying that antitrust enforcement has failed and we cannot rely on rule of reason or balancing exercise or case-by-case approach. We need to put ex ante regulatory compliance rules, broad rules where you wouldn't have precisely this sort of rule of reason. What do you think about these paradigm shift from ex post enforcement to more ex ante regulatory compliance?
We've had paradigm shifts in a lot of ways. We used to have, we used to be obsessed with regulation, and then we moved back from regulation, took a lot of steps backwards on the regulatory side. We praise antitrust because antitrust enforcement, when it's done correctly, does not have the regulatory capture problems of an industry because it's not industry specific. We like that. But at the same time, I do think there is a role for regulation. The question is how to cabin that role so that we don't get carried away. There are certain obligations that dominant firms clearly should have, but we don't want to turn them into utilities, regulated utilities. So I think there is certainly a role for reasonable regulation. The problem, of course, is that once we get the politics involved in the regulatory process, out comes the sausages, and it can get pretty ugly in the process. And so, reasonable regulations, but how do you keep it reasonable?
That's very hard, and precisely when you, as you say, the legislature or the politics step in, and the line is very thin between these regulatory obligations and what you just said, essential facilities and these public utilities doctrines, or because to some extent, if we apply this sort of telecommunications regulation style to high-tech technology, we are coming closer to public utility style regulation. Do you see this this kind of threat, these risks, or are you more comfortable with the direction these debates take?
There is certainly a risk. It's a concern. It really depends on how it all turns out, and that's questionable. I mean, I do think that there's a potential for amendments to antitrust, which are possibly beneficial. We see some regulatory proposals in the U.S. that I think would have beneficial consequences.
You refer to Senator Amy Klobuchar's bill
I think
on.
there's good things in the bill. I'm not sure I would agree with everything that's in the bill. I haven't read it that closely, but some of the things that I've seen look okay.
Perhaps on mergers?
Yeah, some of the, changing some of the presumptions and, changing some of the liability conditions imposed on those who violate the antitrust laws. There are ways to improve the antitrust laws. And in the U.S., we have gone so far away from the essential facilities doctrine that it almost doesn't exist at all anymore in the U.S. And I think that's gone too far. Maybe in Europe they've gone the other way and have used the doctrine too much. And it would be nice if we could somehow meet in the middle ground.
In the middle, right in the ocean. So in your book, you refer to these mergers, and you refer to the risks some horizontal mergers, and precisely for monopolization, some horizontal mergers may have. And are we not bound to make this distinction between what we've learned with decades of antitrust economics, between the distinction between vertical mergers and conglomerate mergers on one hand, and on the other hand, horizontal mergers? Sometimes perhaps too easy to talk about mergers as if there was one, right? Do you see the major difference between vertical mergers or horizontal mergers, as opposed to perhaps these legislative proposals where mergers are referred without distinction?
Clearly, there's a difference between the issues that we typically associate with a horizontal merger versus a vertical merger, and almost by definition, when it's vertical, it means a combination does not have a competitive effect, or at least the same kind of competitive effect in a horizontal merger. But it doesn't mean that you cannot have anti-competitive effects from a vertical merger. You definitely can have anti-competitive effects from a vertical merger, and that's where the old style, very price-centric analysis has led us astray. There are problems that can come about with vertical mergers.
Yes, but it is of a different nature. I think we're going to try to take some questions from the audience. I'm sure there are many questions from this great book, and I advise all of you to buy in and read it very carefully, because it's everything you want to know about innovation and competition. Perhaps one few last questions from myself. Dynamic-centric or innovation-centric antitrust enforcement, is it, you said it's forward-looking, it relates to the evolutionary perspective to economics, right? Is it a dynamic view to competition where you try to be forward-looking? But on the other hand, you may have the criticism, or the critics say like, well, but at the end of the day, antitrust is going to be about guessing the future, and it's very hard. Of course, we're either bound to be kind of backward-looking, where there is not this dynamic approach, which is unfortunate. But on the other hand, if we are perhaps too forward-looking, some will say that, well, at the end of the day, we are guessing the future, and it's what would you answer to these criticism of saying you speculate on 3-5 years time, and it's a rough case?
But antitrust enforcement is always forward-looking. I mean, it always involves making an estimation of the effect of a merger. I mean, the Clayton Act says that a merger is anti-competitive if it is likely to have an effect. It's a forward-looking doctrine. Even monopolization policy, even though you might be able to address conduct that has occurred in the past, the real concern is about preventing conduct continuing into the future. And
right.
There's always this argument that, well, maybe we made a mistake in the past, but we'll be nice in the future. So it's inevitable that in any trust you're making a prediction, and there's a risk of both over-enforcement and under-enforcement. The problem is we've not been able to convince courts to take that risk when it comes to things they can't put their finger on. And that goes too far, because we do know that there will be future effects, and sometimes we can be fairly confident about what those future effects are going to be, and courts should not be hesitant to address those effects.
That's very helpful. You say antitrust is inherently forward-looking, and it must not shy of being forward-looking, and we're bound to be forward-looking. That's very
absolutely.
That's very important to remind viewers. We've got one question from the audience here. How important is to distinguish between nationally and globally defined markets? Some argue countries need a global optic in order to raise global champions. This relates to some sort of relationship between competition policy and of course, industrial policy, and of course, with respect to innovation.
Well, the question really raises a lot of interesting issues. One is a very mechanical issue, which is you'd find the market based on the competition, and if it's a local competition, if the market for groceries, it's a local market.
That's easy. That's easy.
And you're not going to worry about the French grocery system if there's a merger in Los Angeles or something like that. That's an easy case. But then there's, when you look into the industries, some of the industries we have today, they're clearly international industries. So they operate in all different types of markets. And it raises the question that even if there's not a level of competition in one market today, will it be tomorrow because of competition issues? It also raises another concern, which is how do we coordinate antitrust policy across different jurisdictions? What does it mean to hold Google accountable in Europe and not in the US, or conversely?
To approve a merger in one jurisdiction and not to approve in another jurisdiction.
Right. And it's interesting to me that if you just describe it like that, it just sounds like a recipe for disaster. But on the other hand, we really have not had that many disasters. And in fact, you could argue that the different approaches to antitrust that we've had across jurisdictions have been informative in many ways.
That's right. We remember this big case 20 years ago between General Electric and Honeywell, where a lot of discussions and tensions between Europe and the US has put. And I think we've done a lot of work for the last 20 years to try to avoid these kind of instances. But in terms of global champions, we can see that even in big tech. If you look at big tech, there might be very large, dominant companies in the US market. But when you compare it with the Chinese big tech, well, they can be in face of a global, of even more stronger competition. Do you see that? Just to refer to the Chinese tech competitors, from Alibaba to WeChat to we have many, which sometimes are even bigger than the American big cake. Do you see that as potential entrants, as a force disciplining the market, or are they too removed from?
As a consumer, I'd like to see more of that competition.
Right.
I think that some of
we see TikTok. TikTok is a Chinese,
and now you get all the political protectionism issues and perhaps security issues that are involved. But yeah, I just think that the opportunity for competition at a highly sophisticated level is something that consumers should welcome, whether it comes from China or Europe, the U.S., wherever. Now, locally or nationally, the concern, of course, in China is that they protect these.
Yes.
Either protect or worry about the political influence of these companies, and that's a different issue.
Yes, definitely. It's a lot of, as we referred, a lot of politics is involved in those issues. But markets are being globalized, and of course, the relevant market, if it's still relevant, it perhaps become more the global market increasingly. So I mean, it has been a great time and great discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Gilbert, for this great discussion about your book. I recall the title, Innovation Matters, Competition Policy for the High Technology Economy, which is at the MIT Press, of course. So I encourage you to buy and to read on these very complex issues of innovation and competition. Thank you very much, Professor. It has been a great pleasure. I just point out the next event we're going to have is going to be on the 9th of April, and we're going to discuss the House report. Last fall, there was a House report on big tech, and we're going to discuss with some experts the House report and its implications, which precisely are starting to unfold into legislative proposals. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
It's been really enjoyable to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you.